So one of the more popular videos we've done in recent times was on that dual overhead cam Chrysler Hemi, the one that never actually made it off the test stand. If you remember, they spun it on an electric motor to like $7 grand, and it cracked some of the lifter bosses. And at that point, NASCAR said no more overhead cam engines. So Ford stopped the development on their cammer, and Chrysler canned that. But it went on. Not so much intended for NASCAR use, because obviously by that point they wanted nothing but pushrod production V8s. But General Motors especially kept pushing for that overhead cam deal. And a lot of you guys mentioned the Oldsmobile. There were two versions of the Oldsmobile. There was the W43, which was a conventional Hemi, a cam in block and regular rockers. And then there was this. And this engine here, this looks like really ready for production with the air cleaner and the exhaust manifolds and the clutch fan. This thing was like ready to drop in the cars and go. And then there was this version of that, which was all aluminum, dual overhead cams. I have no idea what they intended this thing for, but it looks like a badass piece of machinery. And again, dual overhead cam, very similar to the Chrysler effort, but completed, and obviously looks like this was run. But a lot of people don't realize at the same time that the Ford single overhead cam and the Chrysler dual overhead cam engine was going on, Chevrolet was also involved in this. Let's see, where is that single overhead cam? Okay, this is the Chevy version of the camera. This is something that you never hear anybody talk about. But this is a big block Chevy bottom end with heads that look really almost exactly identical to the Ford camera heads. With the single overhead cam, it does use a shorter timing belt, triple row timing chain. They say belt timing chain. It's a lot shorter than the Fords, but this was something that they were working on that again got canned at that same time that NASCAR says nope, nothing but pushrod motors from now on. This was right after that. Chevy said, well, okay, pushrods. So here, they didn't say how many pushrods we could have. So here's an example of a Chrysler, of a Chevy version of the Chrysler Hemi. Now on the Chevy block, the exhaust pushrods didn't have a path to follow to get across the motor like they do on the Chrysler. What they did on this thing was they added a third pushrod. So here's the intake, here's a regular intake rocker, and here's the adjuster for it, and you can see that the pushrod goes like straight down, normal location. And then here's exhaust pushrod part 1, or exhaust rocker part 1. So here you can see the adjuster, and you can follow the path down to the camshaft, through the pushrod. And then this rocker here pushes this pushrod, and this pushrod runs across to exhaust rocker B and actuates it like this. Now, as mousetrap as that looks, and it never made it into production as far as Chevy is concerned, there was a company called Arias that duplicated this setup for a top fuel effort. They tried to do a Chevy-based top fuel engine, and they used this exact setup, and it functioned, it worked. The engines had other problems, and they were more to do with the short deck, short rod nature of the Chevy and how it doesn't particularly like nitro than it had to do with any of this. There weren't any valve train failures that I know of with those engines. But this just gives you an idea of the kind of stuff that the engineers were working on at that time. I keep a stack of old magazines around because these things are gold. Like there was a Gold Major magazines from like 1964 to like 1974, 1975, and then after that they went to shit. And that includes the magazines that I did myself. I'm not proud of that stuff. But anyway, this one here was March 1968. And this was a look at some of the stuff that Pontiac was working on at the time. Now, Pontiac was really the only American manufacturer to put an overhead cam engine into production during this period of time. And that would be this thing, the Tempest 6. These were outstanding motors. It was the first application of a timing belt in an American car. Ford with the Pinto and Chevy with the Vega didn't do it until 1970. This was 1966, and it used a conventional timing belt, just like the kind you'd find on a contemporary car. Single overhead cam, and they used a Rochester 4-barrel intake on these things, or carburetor on these things, and they ran really good. I had a customer back when I was a kid that had a 67 Firebird that had one of these things in it. And I tell you, it was just the sweetest engine, the sweetest combination. With a 4-barrel and a 4-speed, and it had like a 355 gear in it. It didn't have quite the bark or the presence of like the muscle car V8s at the time, so it was kind of overlooked. But these things are true gems. If you ever get a chance to come across one, check it out. This was also, we'll talk about the V8s in a second, but this, as it explains in the story in here, was a version of the Tempest 6 they built with a 471 to torture test the bottom end of the engine, and it passed. So, but anyway, talking about the overhead cam engines, here's Pontiac's dual overhead cam version that looks very much like the Oldsmobile from a couple of years later. This one here used a conventional timing chain at the front. You can see this thing also looks like it's just about ready for production with the Rochester 2GCs and you know, it's got a cast iron exhaust manifold on it. This one here is particularly interesting. Let me go inside the magazine. This one here is a 3-valve, right? So here's the head for it. They used a single intake, almost 2.5-inch intake, and they used a pair of 1.46 exhausts. So they were looking for some seriously heavy breathing with this thing. They also tried it with a pair of intakes and single exhausts, but they felt that there was too much parasitic loss through the 2 ports on the intake side, so they went with a single big intake and the pair of smaller exhausts. And then also on this engine, two unusual features of this thing. The first is that you see that it doesn't have any type of drive in the front. And what they did here was, oh, wait, here's the combustion chamber end of that engine. You see the one big intake and the 2 small exhausts. And then here's the back of that engine. So here's the flywheel, and here's the mount. Here's where like the top of the bell housing would go. And what they did was they ran a timing belt off of a gear, a centrally located gear there, and ran the 2 cams from the back of the engine. So everything was left up the front to you know, the regular accessories. Here's a picture of the way it's packaged. I don't think it was quite as bad as the Ford Exploder 4.0, you know, with the rear-mounted timing chain. What a disaster! But this was probably wasn't a party to service in the car with the firewall in place. But you get the general idea of where they were going with this. And look at this exhaust manifold. I mean, that is just an absolute thing of beauty. This stuff was really close to production. The other unusual thing about this engine, and this is something if any of you guys out there know anything about, I'd really like to find out. You can see that this thing isn't carbureted. It has what appears to be 3 flying toilets and some sort of, I mean, I have no idea what the setup is. I've never seen anything quite like it. It's probably some form of mechanical fuel injection used in the 3 big single throttle bodies. But if any of you guys know anything about that setup, I'd love to find out more about it. So that's pretty much it. Everybody loves these exotic, one-offs and engines that that never quite were, and we're not done with that, because there's one more engine we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, and it was Chrysler's version of the big block Chevy, the thing that was supposed to supersede the 426 Hemi as we knew it, and it was called the ball stud. And there's actually one of these engines that's up and running and installed in a car. So we're going to gather some more information on that, and we'll do another video, one of these videos in a couple of weeks. But anyway, that's it. Back to the more mundane, inline wedges and stuff. Talk to you guys tomorrow.